Hey everyone, how you doing? Feel free to type into the chat where you're calling in from. I realize in the last session of the day, so glad to be here. Give everyone a minute here to join. Get started in about 10 seconds here. Give some folks a couple more minutes to join here. Welcome. Yeah, for folks just joining, feel free to keep it social. It's the last session of the day, so if you want to type into the chat where you're calling in from, it'd be great. Otherwise, I'll go and get started. So I'll probably go about 15, 20 minutes. I am the last session of the day. Appreciate everyone joining. Hopefully I have your attention. I hope to take 15 minutes. What I wanted to share here is some of my experiences taking teams and companies from founder-led sales to a more predictable revenue model. There's this term, it's quite common, called crossing the chasm. So we'll keep it on theme, we'll keep it on brand, and this is what we'll focus on the next 15 minutes or so. A primary thing around my agenda is making sales into a science. The way I like to break that down is I like to think a lot about, especially at a VP of sales level or a CRO level, you're more than just a salesperson. Like revenue encompasses more than just closing deals, right? There's things around the ICP. This is the who. You've probably heard a lot about that. There's commercial insight, which is the what. There's the sales process, and then there's the role as a founder. I give this talk a lot of times to founder-led forums or stuff through the venture community, very early stage. A bridge too far will be when to hire for next time. I'm happy to take questions at the end. So who am I? What's my credibility? Where am I coming from? I was an IC early stage at some pretty fast growing companies. I worked at Box, Zora, and Zenefits. I'd like to say it's probably like the foundational learning of my sales background. From there, I've led teams primarily in the HR space. So in HR, comp, ben, learning, development. Worked at LearnUp. It's an Andreessen-backed company. MindGem is a services company. Hone for a couple years, and now Performicom, heading up the sales team there. I've grown sales a couple times from, I'd say like 4 figures up to 8, and I've done the fractional work as well. I am the Ted Lasso Award winner, I'll have you know, for positive infectious leadership. So here's my picture from the awards ceremony a couple years ago at a company I was at. Cool. Feel free to type in the chat. I'm not monitoring it actively, but I get this question a lot. I'm sure this audience might be a little skewed, but a lot of times people ask this question: are salespeople born salespeople, or is it something you can teach? Right? So the broader question is sales an art, or is it a science? I'm here to say that it's a science. Now, there's some art in it, but we all know the best artists in the world, and here's an example from Picasso, are classically trained. So the foundations that exist and the people at the elite levels in any skill set, whether it's sports or arts or visual arts or music, there's usually a good foundation of like fundamentals. And I'd like to say that in sales, it's very similar. The artistic creativity can come out once you have those foundations. So what are the foundations, right? And where are we talking about? Again, the theme of my talk here is probably a little bit pre-chasm. Most of you have probably seen this book, it's pretty famous at this point, Crossing the Chasm. It talks a lot about moving from like early adopters to more like the mass market. The stage that I'm sort of talking about specifically with this chat, right, is around this early market. It's almost like pre-chasm. Primarily when you're looking at organizations and companies, they're going to have 1 or 2 folks on the sales team, maybe an AE, BDR, someone on renewals potentially, maybe 1 or 2 person in marketing or people in marketing, and a lot of times like the founder or founders are heavily involved. So the theme of this topic that I'm talking about here is talking a lot about crossing the chasm in the pre-chasm stage. So where do you start? You can't just like open your computer and, start blasting out emails. You can, but you really should be clear on your ICP. For you Mad Men fans out there, there's a famous scene from the Belle Jolie episode where Dom Draper's talking about you can only sell to believers, right? And there's kind of a cheeky moment where he asks the non-believers to get up and leave the boardroom. I'm not going to advocate for that in sales. However, it is very important that you are selling to believers. And the purpose of selling to believers is you want to find a path to predictable success with the highest effectiveness, efficiency, and really like the least amount of, dare I say, work, but like the highest efficiency would be the better way of putting it. Now, there's marketers that are more qualified than me potentially in this regard. And there's a lot of folks, at the CRO, CMO level that talk a lot about this. But from my vantage point, taking over founder-led sales, it's important to be ruthless in your prioritization and defining ICP. When I think of ICP, I think it's an exercise you have to go through. There's qualitative and quantitative components. And I would challenge you to look at the company as an ICP and then the individuals in that company. Company is usually like for folks that you're going to target. You can run lists, you can run campaigns, you can run searches in Clay, Apollo, SalesNav, etc. The individual, there's going to be a lot of qualitative stuff around early adopters. And it's important to get the buyer personas right on all of these before you start hitting the phones and hitting the emails. So here's some examples of folks that I've had that have been early adopters in my career. A lot of times you'll see that folks, are innovators and thought leaders themselves, whether they're speaking at conferences or they have qualifications on LinkedIn. But this is really important in the ICP level, at the individual level, and you're thinking about buyer personas. So think about what an ICP is, right? And there's a lot of writing on this. There's this gentleman, TK, who was the founder of ToutApp back in the day, who's I take a lot of inspiration from. So shout out TK. And he's on LinkedIn, or he's on LinkedIn, of course, but he's also on YouTube. And he talks a lot about when you're thinking early stage, think of your initial customer profile. This is a little more founder skewed, this statement, but I would say there's a tendency to think, well, what is my TAM? And you want to make it really big, of course, when you're fundraising. However, when you're doing sales, think initial customer profile. Be ruthless. Really try to hone in on those concentric circles and get to the smallest, most relevant, closest fit of ICP from the company and individual level that you can. Okay. Break to the next section. We've determined who our ICPs are. So what are we going to say? What makes you different? Now, again, in early stage sales and in founder-led, and this is most of my background, there's a fantastic founder story, a personal story, a mission, something that's, been the genesis of the company, right? But I would say when you start to bring on sales folk, it's really important to think about what is your commercial insight. There's a lot of writing on this. Of course, in the Pavilion channels, there's going to be a lot of folks that are familiar with Challenger Sale. I like Challenger Customer as a follow-up book because it talks a lot about, mobilizers on the buyer side. But I think it's really important to find a commercial insight, right? And the reason for this is that in early stage sales from startups, you're going to be competing against incumbents, folks that have, more robust marketing, probably better, security or technical specs, certainly more, existing customers. But 53% of the sale is the customer loyalty is still going to be driven on sales excellence. So you can close that gap. You can beat incumbents at their own game if you're fantastic in identifying the right folks in ICP and if you have a good commercial insight. So go and find a good commercial insight. Now, what is a commercial insight? Probably a whole another session. But what I will say, it's teaching customers something new about their business and prompts them to take action. Okay. So this is the key part, right? This is not just, it's a compelling, defensible perspective from a supplier. This is from the book. That material impacts a customer's performance and directly leads to your unique capabilities. So the key part that I like here is that it's going to prompt the buyer to take action as a commercial insight. So similar to the ICP exercise, when you're thinking about concentric circles, when you're advising or working or developing a commercial insight in your positions, what I would challenge you to do is get out of thought leadership, branding, content marketing, and really try to hone in on commercial insight, right? And this is something that there's a lot of examples, and we can take some questions maybe later on about this, but this is really about honing in on something more specific as opposed to just like a thought leadership. The third stage of making sales a science, now that you have the who and you have the what, is the how. Now, this is an eye chart, so I don't want any eye rolls on it, but we do need a sales process, right? A lot of times you'll hear buyer journey, that's fine. However, in early stage sales, you're going to be winning or losing deals based on your credibility and your ability to close the credibility gap in the market, right? Now, the buyer is going to want a fairly prescribed journey, right? And a lot of times in early stage startup, if you're going to use BANT as a qualifier and you ask the question, do you have budget allocated for, X solution? There is no budget a lot of times, right? There's no line item. There might be for an HRIS or performance management in the HR world, but a lot of times there's not. So create a process, right, that matches what your buyers expect. However, that follows a path that you can be prescriptive and descriptive in your steps. This is an example of one that I've done for a client, but things I like to just call out, and this, relates to your qualification in your HubSpot or Salesforce, is what are you doing at this stage? Around what meeting are you at? Who's involved? And the key thing is to get out of this stage, what do you need to see? Okay. And this will help you forecast a little bit more accurately. I mean, really at any stage of a company, but certainly in the early stages, it takes the mystique out of forecasting and it applies like a little more predictability to it. A couple added benefits. I have 2 slides here. If you have a sales process, look, you can start to identify where you're going to get really good and where you might need areas of opportunity. I like to think that first call excellence, first meeting, second meeting are the key things, right? This is where you're really having to get like issue matching and value alignment, and you're having to make folks believe that you're a credible solution, certainly more credible than the incumbents. I don't want to over-engineer this. Certainly in later stage orgs and bigger companies, yeah, fine. You can, when you have rev ops and sales ops, you can over-engineer this. My background is primarily under 10 million in revenue. I would say if you're advising founders, don't over-engineer this because their eyes might roll and they might, just want revenue in the door quickly. However, if you get a good framework or template in place around a sales process, you can start measuring the percentages, right? Like, where are the gaps? Are you booking a ton of meetings and you're just not able to convert them into ops? Are you getting stuck mid-cycle where people are like, wow, this is great, but they don't actually have budget for you and they won't introduce you to the stakeholders internally? Or are you completely incapable of booking first meetings? Like, there's a million variables that can happen early stage. So just know where your gaps are. If you have a framework of a sales process, I think it helps. Now, again, this talk, my team, the folks that I work with are primarily seed A, sometimes Series B founders, and certainly CEOs. So the comment that I usually get is, wow, this sounds really complicated, Greg. Do I really have to do all this? Well, you know what? You should do some of it. And I mean, selfish plug for myself, of course. I've done it. And if folks are in the market and they need help, I can help. But that's not why we're here. What I would advocate for is don't over-engineer, but don't be a mad scientist, right? Like, you have to be a little bit predictable here. And you should put some things in place around ICP, insight, and process that make you a professional organization and make you a better solution than the incumbents. Maybe my final little section, and then we might end early, and I'm happy to take questions, is I get the question a lot of times, what should I do as a founder? I've developed what I call the bow tie model. Certainly haven't developed the bow tie, but in founder-led sales, I like to think of it as the bow tie model. So what I have found in clients that I've worked with is that a founder's story and a founder's brand is imperative, to develop pipeline. So I like to think if you put these things in place, the founders and the CEO is going to be very involved typically at the pipeline level. So if you think about time of deal, this is from referrals and investor intros and executive connections, advisory board, all that type of stuff. And then the founder needs to be involved, or the CEO certainly, or an executive sponsor, let's call it, as an exec sponsor later in deals. So, in early stage startups, there's a lot of things you don't want to overpromise, but there's going to be, some things you might have to speak about around product roadmap or legal or pricing later in the stage of the cycle. So if you're a founder and you got a really qualified person who's going to follow this methodology, I would take your hands off the wheel a little bit in these mid stages, of a deal life cycle. but continue to be pretty actively involved, at the start. Certainly hold your team accountable in the middle. And then at the end, I think you should want to be personally involved as an exec sponsor in closing deals. I have a couple examples of folks I've worked with in the past who I think do a very good job of this. Here's some kind of tips and tricks. This goes a little bit more to BDR and marketing. But if you're going to be a bow tie, be really good at the top of the funnel. Be a brand. You are the brand, and a lot of times, be the chief evangelist. Have a founder email alias. Allow the SDRs to maybe control your personal LinkedIn. Be posting regularly, and then hold your team accountable. And then hold your team accountable. Be an exec sponsor on the key deals, but hold the team accountable, for the mid stages of the sales cycle. We can talk hiring and scaling for another day, being it's the last session of the day. That's actually all the content that I have. I'm happy to pause, and I'm happy to take questions. That's all I got. Appreciate the shout outs from anyone. Open any questions, Shing, if you got anything for me or anything, any guidance for me here? No.
I was waiting for you to do the honors of hitting the big red button.
I'll hit end session right now. Sounds good.
Thank you very much.